Good evening, everyone. My name is Guy Lancaster, and I serve as the editor of the Online Encyclopedia of Arkansas, which is a project of the Central Arkansas Library System. I would like to welcome you to tonight's discussion with Dr. Aleshia O'Neal, titled Charlie Mae Simon, Uncovering the Lost Voice of an Arkansas Author. This lecture is one of three such lectures that are part of the Monday Matriarch series hosted by the Central Arkansas Library System as a part of Women's History Month. I'll post a link to all the Monday Matriarch lectures at Cal's in the chat. And if you want to visit the research room of the Bobby L. Roberts Library of Arkansas History and Art for your own historical or genealogical inquiries, we're open to the public right now, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 10 to 5. If you enjoyed this talk tonight, you might want to tune in on March 18 when Arkansas Sounds will be presenting a tribute to Sister Rosetta Tharpe. I'll also put a link to that event in the chat. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Aleshia O'Neal, is an English professor at York College in York, Nebraska. She became interested in Charlie Mae Simon while researching on her doctorate in heritage studies at Arkansas State University, and her research for her dissertation took her to 4 archival collections that house the diaries, correspondence, photographs, and official documents of this writer, whose literary career spanned 4 decades. Following this presentation, we will have a brief Q&A. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to put them into the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the talk. And with that, I will turn this over to Dr. O'Neal.
Okay, I think I'm off mute now. Good evening. I'm very excited to be sharing with everyone tonight Charlie Mae Simon and interesting information about her life, her work, and it's a pleasure for me to be able to talk with you about Charlie Mae Simon. So thank you to the Central Arkansas Library System for hosting the Monday night matriarchs throughout this month. I think it's a great series. Enjoyed Dr. Williams last Monday, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the series, what we have. But in tonight's presentation, I'm going to be discussing the life and the published novels of noted Arkansas author Charlie Mae Simon. Charlie Mae is a woman whose writing career spanned 4 decades, during which time she remained an Arkansas resident. Yet none of her 29 published novels, biographies, or memoirs remain in print today. Although a yearly award was established in 1970 by the Arkansas Department of Education, it's called the Charlie Mae Simon Book Award, given to new fiction title that Arkansas middle school children vote on as their favorite yearly. Educators and librarians have difficulty obtaining copies of her own writing that set that high bar of excellence that each award recipient demonstrates. My purpose in researching and writing during my dissertation was to uncover the prose beauty of Charlie Mae Simon's writing, examining the history of her life and the times in which she produced her work. And I also wrestled with the factors that caused her voice to go silent, lost to our current generation. The research that I conducted occurred in 4 special collections archives: the Butler Center of Arkansas Studies, UALR Center for Arkansas History and Culture, University of Memphis Libraries, and Syracuse University in New York. Research on the life of Charlie Mae Simon included analysis of her published works as well. I implemented new historicism, it's a field of literary criticism, as my methodological approach to contemplate the cultural impact, historical events, and the life occurrences that fueled the creative spirit of Arkansas's prolific author of the 20th century. So you might wonder what began my interest in this woman, Charlie Mae Simon. And I would say that in my Southern literature class, if I can get my slide to advance, There we go. In my Southern literature class, in one of my courses for my doctorate, I was wanting to find the voice of a woman during the Depression who was speaking to the experience of women, and specifically was wanting to find someone who did not have a lot of scholarly articles already published about that individual. I was first going to go with Maya Angelou because I'm a huge fan of all of her writing, and I knew of her experience in stamps. But there is a vast amount of scholarly research already in the field about Maya. And as I was doing a Google search one night, I just chanced upon, I did narrative depression women writers, because I specifically wanted to hear the women's voices, as very often they were marginalized. And came across Charlie Mae Simon, and she was someone I didn't have any idea of who this woman was. So on a whim, I ordered her memoir called Straw in the Sun, purchased the discarded library copy. It was published in 1945, but it retold her homesteading experience in Perry County, Arkansas in the 1930s. At the height of the Depression, an unemployed artist and his wife decided to leave New York City, the scene of bread lines, and they retreated to the land to wait out the economic downturn by a meager living and subsistence farming. So this was the story I decided to chase. When the copy arrived, it was a discarded library copy, smelled kind of musty. I discovered the voice of a woman whom time had forgotten. Opening the musty pages of that memoir, I read the following. Last spring, I went to Rocky Crossing again. New green grass was sprouting on the high ridge of the road that led there. And now and then there grew a persimmon shoot or a small hickory where a nut had fallen and opened deep in the untrampled earth. But the ruts made long ago by passing wagons were still there, guiding the wheels of our car through the dense forest, around the boulders, and between the tall trees. I was like a ghost returning to a place once loved. Struck by the poetry of her prose, I turned back the page to examine the front inscription, and a quote by Thoreau struck me. I'm startled that God can make me so rich even with my own cheap stores. It needs but a few wisps of straw in the sun, some small word dropped, or one that has lain long silent in some book. The irony of the fact hit me. I was doing exactly what she described. Captivated, I spent that weekend absorbing her experience in poverty, her careful depiction of the Ozark Hill people as an ethnographer living among them, and her realization of the richness that surrounded their lives. When I finished, I couldn't help but wonder, why has this memoir fallen into a discard heap? Why is this Arkansas writer forgotten? Following a breadcrumb trail leading me through a dense forest of primary sources, those questions continue to fuel my research into the life of Charlie Mae Simon. Years later, I continue to hypothesize and do what I call Simonizing as I piece together her life story through the primary sources that are available. The designation of wartime book on the copyright page of Straw in the Sun, complete with a banner carried by the American Eagle that states, "Books are weapons in the wars of ideas," summarizes what I see as Charlie Mae Simon's philosophy on the role of literature in society. I believe Charlie Mae was an author who recognized this principle and spent her life advancing ideas of peace, community, and acceptance in a society that was deeply divided by racism and prejudice. The first question I was compelled to ask, who is this woman? What was her role and identity as an author? And more importantly to me, who was she as a woman? And how did she respond to the societal constraints of her time? These are questions not easily answered, I've discovered. It is difficult to find Charlie May's identity, as many voices spoke to her in archival records, but few records of her own voice remain outside her published works. Hoag was a name she embraced, even requesting to keep it in her writing career. For my purposes, I simply refer to the author in the unscholarly manner of Charlie May, knowing that her preference was to change her pen name. The enigma of identity, however, remains. To begin the process of analyzing what hides Charlie May's voice from our view, we must recognize the different era she lived in. Women's right to vote was gained in 1920 while she was in her first marriage, and the doors to higher education were just beginning to open for women. Her reaction to this environment speaks to her life work. She was a suffragette, working in rallies and pushing for social change. She also supported the single tax movement. In records I uncovered, I consistently found that Charlie May was an individual who pushed for social change and rights for those marginalized in society. This was also a recurring theme in her writing. From her beginnings, it's important to recognize the first voice of influence in Charlie May's life, her father, Charles Wayman Hoag. Consider first her name, Charlie for her father, Charles, and May for her mother, Mary. The name created ambiguity. On the family's 1910 census, Charlie is delineated as a son, the recorder obviously interpreting the name as male. In the archives, I found reviews in newspapers and occasional letters from individuals who read her books, sometimes mistakenly assuming she was a man. Her father, Charles, published a memoir in 1932, the narrative recording his life homesteading in the Ozarks as a boy. Ironically, this was the same year Little House on the Prairie was published by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Both authors had daughters who served as editors, possibly to the point of ghostwriting in sections. In letters throughout her adult life, Charles was Papa, a voice that gave her family history, information about pioneer homesteading life, suggestions for future work, encouragement on current projects and past failures, and support for her adult choices, even when he disagreed with them. Here we have a picture of Charlie May and her older sister, circa 1899. Charlie May was born in 1897, so this would be when she was 2 years old. And I didn't mention she was born near Monticello, Arkansas. Her father was a tenant farmer, born in a log cabin. So she came from meager roots and always appreciated the family connection and homesteading. Although Back Yonder is Wayman Hoag's only published book-length work, he is mentioned on every book flap Charlie May published to lend credibility to her curriculum vitae. A pattern developed in the male-dominated literary world. Charlie May's credibility came from the success of men who were patriarchally connected to her. On December 28th, 1920, the last name Hoag became Lowenstein when she married Walter Lowenstein, a Memphis mercantile businessman who was 17 years her senior and the sole male heir to the Lowenstein fortune. Walter Lowenstein is an enigma, much like Charlie May, yet lacking the archival collections to fill in the missing blanks and questions. Few records can be found on his life. In the 1900 census of Memphis, he is shown as a 21-year-old salesman, indicating he might be involved in the family business. Yet he disappears from Memphis, becoming a dairy farmer and then a ranch hand in future census reports and draft registration. Upon his father's death in 1919, he returns to Memphis to help his brother-in-laws manage the mercantile business. There is no indication of how the two met, nor of why the 40-year-old bachelor finally decided to marry. Perhaps the fact that Charlie May was 23, level-headed, and self-sufficiently independent as a wage earner caused him to rethink his stance against eligible women after his father's death. Photos of Lowenstein, which remained in Charlie May's possession until her death, show a thoughtful man. Articles written after their marriage support his intellectual charisma, which would have attracted Charlie May. A decade later, John Gould Fletcher's suit for marriage offered intellectual companionship, and the age difference was comparable to that which existed between Charlie May and Walter Lowenstein. Specifically in this phase of her life, scholarly sources, though scant in number, reveal errors that were repeated through decades of any research that surfaced on Charlie May. Questions remain unanswered. How did they meet? How did this common girl of working class family meet and marry the wealthy heir? Considering the fact the Lowenstein family donated the mansion on Jefferson Avenue to the city of Memphis upon Elias's death, intending their grand structure to become a boarding house for single women coming from rural areas to be employed in the city factories, it's possible that Charlie May met him through the connections of friends who were boarders in the socially protected housing for female wage earners. Her father also ran a mercantile business in Memphis, so perhaps that was the connection. However, both were also politically active in campaigns that occurred. Charlie May indicates in her memoir, Johnswood, that she was involved with women of Memphis in political causes, single tax campaigns, protests against the war, and suffragette rallies during her teenage years and early 20s. She declares herself to have an impatient urge to build a perfect world within the space of our own lifetime, believing, too, that our solution was the only one. Most of those scholarly articles I mentioned state their marriage happened in 1918. However, the genealogical records I uncovered show the marriage occurred on December 28, 1920. Articles also state he died 7 years later, yet the death certificate I found shows their marriage lasted 2.5 years before his sudden death on August 8, 1923. Her initials noted as a surviving widow. One source even goes so far as to state she married him for his money, knowing he was dying. He is described as an eloquent and instructive speaker while participating in the single tax campaigns. Since Charlie May also references her involvement in single tax campaigns in her memoir, this indicates she and Walter were involved together in political activism. To counter views presented that she married Lowenstein solely for money, I assert the marriage was a result of shared political views, mutual respect, and genuine affection. In Straw in the Sun, she mentions losing the money left by someone very dear to her when the bank that held the Simons savings failed. This would be the reference to the family settlement given to her following his death. And another argument that I uncovered in the research showed that she and Walter were both booked passage. They would be sailing to Hawaii 2 months after he died. His death was sudden, and she ended up going alone to retrieve the materials that were waiting in Walter's name. Following Lowenstein's death, Charlie May traveled to Paris to study art. There, she met Howard Simon, a 22-year-old aspiring artist. 4 days after meeting her, Howard proposed. So at 29 years of age in 1926 in Grand Paris, Charlie May Hogue Lowenstein became Charlie May Simon, acquiring the pen name that would serve her throughout her writing career. Interestingly, it was also Howard's inability to find gainful employment that led to the launching of her writing career. In 1930, the couple was living in New York City and found there to be a scarcity of work for an artist during the Great Depression. The Simons decided to leave for Arkansas, retreating to the land and homesteading in the area where Charlie May's father grew up, the Ozark Hills. And they were called the Ozark Hills at that time, even though now we would call them in a different mountain range, in the Ouachita forest. Their experiment resulted in an experience in poverty when that bank failed that held their savings. Left impoverished, Howard drew portraits for neighbors and woodcut drawings in exchange for the food that would sustain them. And Charlie May turned to writing. A talented artist, Howard was the illustrator of her early works, even well into the 1940s after their divorce, which occurred in 1936. He continued to illustrate her work, although replacements were sought and brought to her publisher, John McCrae. Yet none of them had the quality McCrae saw in Simon's work. So against Charlie May's preference and that of her new husband, Howard Simon remained her illustrator. These are some examples of the first books that Charlie May Simon would write: Lost Corner, Popo's Miracle. I put these in there just so you could have an idea of the compelling nature of the illustrations. Howard Simon truly was, I feel, part of what drew youngsters to Charlie May's work, much like Garth Williams with Laura Ingalls Wilder. Very simplistic, very homespun, and drew the children in. This is a current map of the land where they did the homesteading. Rocky Crossing, you can still find it on the topographical maps. That was the crossing that wagons would have to go around if it was flooded, like the days of the great rains near Hollis, and in between Hollis and Perryville. She mentions Perryville also in her memoir, but this is the area in the Ouachita National Forest. And these are pictures of the cabin where they did their homesteading. They built the cabin with help from neighbors, chopped the logs down, had the neighbors help with the roofing, everything. The chimney apparently remains. I have not been able to find the foundation pieces, even though we have been there to see the land in its current state. Although Howard suggested the enterprise, adjusting to homesteading life came more naturally to Charlie May than it did to her husband. She was returning to the land where her ancestral roots ran deep. Her family had homesteaded in the valley below the ridge where they built their cabin, coming to that area in the 1860s. Returning to the mountain area, her ancestor connections allowed the Simons to be accepted among a people who tended to be clannish and suspect of what they called foreigners. Coming from Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and North Carolina, these early settlers had built their cabins in the rich valleys at first, but then drifted to the seclusion of the hills as available homesteading land for farming became scarce. Rumors of wars and other national events filtered slowly to their region. It was the local affairs and that of the clan that affected the typical Ozarker, not national issues. Charlie May references this in her memoir of the Homestead years, remarking how news of Japan invading Manchuria and the possibility of the United States joining a war reached her weeks after the event, national news being secondary to local events and gossip. Walking 10 miles one way to the Valley store weekly for mail and supplies, Charlie May would learn news of the community as well as news of the outside world. Radios were uncommon and electricity was non-existent. When civilized life touched the hill people, it often left scarring marks. Fences broken, crops trampled that were needed for survival, or corn whiskey stills destroyed that provided the needed income for hill people. Charlie wrote of the homesteading experience and the lives of the self-reliant hill people in an article that was published by Scribner's Magazine in May 1933. The article accomplished three things: provided money for food to live on in their last year of homesteading, generated public attention that created the link with her future publisher, E.P. Dutton, and dealt the death blow to her already strained marriage. It was this article that brought an ardent admirer to her cabin doorstep, John Gould Fletcher, an Arkansas poet, whom you can see in this picture. These were photos that Fletcher took when he visited the homestead, and also the pictures that I showed previously. These were all from Fletcher's visit, pictures that he took to commemorate the event. Fletcher paid visits to the Simons after developing an obsessive desire to meet the woman who wrote of his native state and the Ozark people so eloquently, with the knowledge of their folk culture that surpassed his own. Fletcher was interested and involved with Vance Randolph in creating a folk society in Arkansas. To him, the Simons represented the siren's call that he could not resist, living amidst folk art and folklore captured in its purest, unadulterated form. In his autobiography, Life is My Song, Fletcher speaks of his visits to their homestead called Possum Trot, one visit in May 1934 and the second in September 1935. At the first visit, Charlie May declared to him that her chief desire and ambition had been to be a good wife to her husband. In spite of this admission, Fletcher persisted in his attempts to woo the woman, openly confessing his conduct later in his memoir. After lunch, we did indeed steal out of the house together to sit for an instant side by side close to the honeysuckle wreathed well at the back of the house. But we were soon interrupted by Howard Simon, who came out and looked at me sourly and suspiciously. But my heart felt no qualm of conscience at the prospect of betraying another husband. Nothing in the least mattered but Charlie May. There's Howard, the king of the castle, standing outside their door. Visitors that arrived came by and saw them while they were there. These are also Fletcher's photos. I believe these actually are the Butler Center's photos, not the UALR Center. Here, I find this interesting. Look at the suspicious man. Fletcher was holding a camera, modern convenience, very suspicious of individuals from the city. And Charlie May is talking to the neighbors. Notice she's holding a child. In this picture here, the woman is smiling for the camera. And Fletcher mentions in his memoir that it was Charlie May holding this child that made him all the more obsessed with wedding her. He wanted to have a child with Charlie May. He he wanted to marry and he wanted her to be the mother of his children. Now, this is the Homestead Land today. We did go out to the land so I could find my muse. Rocky crossing that is still there at Cove Creek. And this is a picture of the cabin. This is in front of the cabin, a picnic that serves as a setting for the introduction of Straw in the Sun. It was really interesting. The Fletchers, when they were building their home that overlooks the river, they were going to live in the cabin. So they had brought all kinds of modern conveniences out. We're moving everything out. They took this picture in front of the cabin. And then that night, a storm came up in Arkansas. Supposedly lightning hit the cabin and burned it to the ground. And so they were not able to come back to that hill culture. And I find it really interesting because in her memoir, she immediately, even though she doesn't come straight out and say it, she immediately, her first question when they tell her the news, she asks about, is this individual still here? And it's someone who was known for setting fires. The Hill people were very protective. They were very distrustful of Fletcher. And it's possible someone decided to burn the cabin down instead of him being able to come and live amongst them. Charlie May was accepted, but it didn't look like Fletcher was necessarily as well received. So this is Charlie May sitting on the ruins, posing for a picture before her memoir, Straw in the Sun, was published. One gets a sense from reading his autobiography that to Fletcher, Charlie May was a trophy prize to win. He was a man at 49, quickly approaching 50, who wanted to best a young, dashing man in his mid-30s. Fletcher was a domineering man with high passion and a fiery temper. He believed Charlie May belonged in Arkansas, and she did decide to stay behind while Howard left for New York. They arranged the divorce. Howard married Mina Lewitton 3 days after Charlie May and John Gould Fletcher were married. And ironically, Howard's new wife was also an author of children's literature, and he was the illustrator for her work as well. After their marriage, Fletcher remarks that he possessed half a share in Charlie May's homestead. And Charlie May, busy as she was with her third book, Teeny Gay, yet had plenty of time to entertain my friends, to act as a capable and efficient housewife. This is the identity Fletcher wanted to fashion for his wife. He was a misogynistic man who perhaps felt the need to domesticate her adventurous spirit and reducing her intelligent mind. Letters written to John Gould Fletcher after his first visit show an interesting insight to Charlie May, a sense of her hidden identity. She and Howard had left Possum Trot and were living in a hotel room in New York City. He created woodcuts to illustrate a magazine for the hotel, acquiring lodging in return. She was homesick for the homestead cabin and the quiet repose of nature. She was writing a fantastic tale of two children lost in the Arkansas woods and expressed her desire to write an adult book of the Civil War, a significant literary contribution. In a haunting statement, she discloses, "I think then, for the first time, I shall find pleasure in writing." Lost Corner, the manuscript she refers to in this letter, would become her second book released for children. 27 more would follow, yet never the novel of importance that she so desired. Throughout their 14 years of marriage, a pattern developed that was predictable. When finances were tight, Charlie May would write a children's book that E.P. Dutton and Company would publish. As a result, over the course of 3 decades, Charlie May Simon, the author, grew in popularity with children, teachers, and librarians across the country. Her regional tales, told with simplicity, struck a chord with boys and girls yearly. Each spring brought a new tale from their author. Yet it vexed her husband that she carried Simon's name with her fame and his art in her books. There was the power of public association and recognition. Fletcher could not wrest from the other man's hands, despite the fact that he had won Howard's wife. Letters of communication between Charlie May and her publisher, and also letters to her parents, revealed the frustration that Fletcher had continually that her last name, Simon, was what was on the books. As Charlie May's success rose, Fletcher's was in decline, rejected by one university after another for lecturer positions, manuscripts and poems falling into the return to cinder pile. His depression grew along with jealousy of his wife's talent, even with the laurel granted of his Pulitzer Prize in Poetry in 1938. Biographer Ben Jonson remarks, Charlie May and John Gould Fletcher's years of marriage were marked by the increasing ferocity of his depression and her remarkable strength and forbearance. On the other hand, Charlie May was not disillusioned or eclipsed in this marriage. She did not exhaust her creative energies, insulating her spouse. Fletcher acknowledged envy of his wife's superior narrative talent in a diary entry of July 21st, 1938, stating of her recent manuscript, her last chapters are magnificent. Her characters all live and are strong. I wish I could write like this, but apparently I cannot. The summer before his suicide, Fletcher admitted to a close friend the struggles of their marriage. Further, he was contemplating divorce as his wife was becoming a more masculine, modern woman. Fletcher is the last name by which Charlie May was known until her death in 1977. In fact, Mrs. John Gould Fletcher is how she is referred to in most articles throughout her writing career. Mrs. Fletcher, wife of the Pulitzer Prize winning poet John Gould Fletcher, is actually the most common nomenclature attributed to her in book flaps, articles, introductions to speeches that she is giving. Her moniker bears the shadow of a man whose creative work and talent he said she surpassed, the confession he made in private letters. So who was this masculine, modern woman's voice when she was alive? So who heard it? Children all over the state of Arkansas were the ones who listened intently, waiting patiently each year for it to light their imagination as moral characters jumped from the pages when they opened the book covers, reading her carefully crafted stories of young boys and girls in Arkansas, and also exotic places. To the fifth grade class, pictured in this photo, Charlie May Simon represented the ability to succeed regardless of one's upbringing. Often decked in pearls and white gloves, Simon was obviously idolized by the boys and girls who read about her heroes' lives. After the suicide death of John Gould Fletcher, Charlie May wrote another memoir, Johnswood, granting a loving tribute to their years of marriage while also revealing the devastating effects of his manic depression on their marriage. She then left the field of fiction and ventured into the genre of biography. As a result, young readers and adults around the world heard the voice of Charlie May as her travels took her out of the state of Arkansas to visit and live in foreign places, writing about noted humanitarians. She was selected to write about the life of Albert Schweitzer. So she traveled and lived in Africa. Here you have pictures from that book that he has written, inscribed to Charlie May. To research for a biography about the Crown Prince, she lived and taught at a women's university in Japan for 3 years. This is a picture of Charlie May and Tohiko Kagawa, the individual that she was writing of in A Siege Shall Serve. He created orphanages for the street children in Japan. I love this one. Charlie May shooting the rapids in Japan. Here we have a Palm Sunday, 1961 in Japan. Notice here on the inscription, the book flap, I've highlighted areas that it gives a description of who she is. She's the wife of distinguished poet, the daughter of Wyman Hogue, and her husband is the one who gets to write of her on her writing ability. Like her father, Charlie May is slow in getting started on any important enterprise. She has never, to my knowledge, undertaken any book until she has both plot and characters well outlined in her mind. And even then, she has been known to spend weeks on each of the earlier chapters, testing characters till she feels she knows them by heart. Yeah. In another letter, he said that he felt like he was the best one to be able to speak to her, so he demanded the ability to write that of her. She also was an advocate for peace. Here she is in their Little Rock home, picture with, I think that's Marjorie Benay. She was awarded an honorary PhD from the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville during her sunset years. She also received the Schweitzer Book Award. And these were all in the 70s when she was a woman in her 70s. And then the Charlie May Simon Book Award designation, which occurred in 1970 by the Arkansas Department of Education and is now jointly held with the Arkansas Library Association as well. The first book award was given in 1971. Yet, interestingly, on her final biography published 3 years before her death, at the age of 79, after publishing 29 titles that included 2 memoirs, 16 works of children's fiction, 1 adult fiction novel, 2 biographical collections of artists and poets, and 9 biographies. Following her credentials were the words, her husband was the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, John Gould Fletcher. Even in her obituary, that epitaph was her crown. When introduced at a conference in Fayetteville as Mrs. John Gould Fletcher, a male friend of hers in the audience objected privately to this introduction, stating, anyone can get married, but few people can write books. And so in my dissertation, work, and current research, I maintain that Charlie May Simon's life and words deserve to be reconsidered and regarded again in this generation, to be seen in light, in the public light, not in the ubiquitous shadows cast by men of her time. And that is our presentation. So we are open to any questions and answers that I hopefully would be able to give you on Charlie May, the author.
Thank you very much. Your presentation reminded me, I was at a bookstore that was like closing out in Blytheville, Arkansas, Books Plus. They were selling 500 books for $40. So as you can imagine, the friend and I who went there were basically doing this.
Sure.
But one of the books I got was, and I got it just for the title, it was an old book called The Miracles of the Antichrist by a Swedish author named Selma Lagerlöf. And I read it and I thought, this book is so amazing. You know, it was like published in the early 20th century in English. And then doing a little more digging, found out she was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature.
Wow.
But, you know, her books had fallen out of print in English. And I mean, do you think it's just the situation that women's work is often, it's just so much easier for it to fall out? It is just marginalized and
It definitely was marginalized, and a lot, I do believe, even though I couldn't go into everything, the thousands and thousands of letters, correspondence, diaries that I just pages and pages that I went through working on this. It was intriguing to me to see the way in which the men in the publishing industry dismissed her actually quite intelligent business moves. And often their opinion held sway. Even her husband or her father might have opinions that would be listened to. But we're talking in the 30s and 40s, it was very difficult for her to navigate a writing career. She wanted to leave, actually, she wanted to leave children's literature. She wanted to do a notable work, and her biographies show the ability for research and the ability, especially Straw in the Saw. That's my favorite of Charlie May's books. Straw in the Sun shows her ability to turn a phrase, her ability to create prose. And I think it's interesting. Her publisher, John McCrae at E.P. Dutton, knew where the money was. The market was in the children's books, and she had a following. And so despite her continued requests, can I do this book title instead? He expected yearly there to be a children's book. And you can surely, while you're writing a children's book, surely you'll be able to work on your novel, as if writing children's literature in a way that wasn't lecturing and preachy was an easy thing to do.
right. Very difficult.
So that's interesting to me. Yes, it was difficult. Often the men who dominated the culture, and also just not as much opportunity given for women to be taken as seriously.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that doesn't get appreciated. You describe someone as a children's books author. It's actually very difficult to write children's literature that's compelling and that stays with you even when you're grown up.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. And I've read all of her books, all 29. I have all of them. Some I appreciate more than others. But one thing that I really did appreciate about Charlie Mae Simon, which I touched on just a little bit, she would go and live with the people that she wrote about. When she was writing about Teenie Gay and her life on the river, she went and lived on a riverboat. When she was writing Popo's Miracle, she went and lived in Mexico. She was writing about Albert Schweitzer. She went to Africa. She experienced it. What we would see a century later, that's what travel writers do. She was an ethnographer. And what I really liked about her approach in writing is that she would look for ways to bring society together. She truly was looking for peace, pointing out differences in culture and not seeing that as a reason for division, but instead just showing the beauty of that culture instead of marginalizing those individuals, instead of showing the poverty of the people who lived along the river in those river boats, or the individuals who were living in Mexico that she was living amongst. She showed the richness of the culture. And I thought that was a beautiful, beautiful thing that the children in the 30s and 40s would have been exposed to in her writing.
Okay, we do have a few questions in the
Okay.
chat. One, do you think John's assessment of Charlie Mae Simon's masculinity was because not many women were recognized in the 40s and 50s, nor as traveled?
I'm sorry, say it again, Guy. I had a hard time hearing that.
Do you think John's assessment of Charlie Mae Simon's masculinity was because not many women were recognized in the 40s and 50s, nor as traveled?
Yes, and I also think she was the one who drove the car. John Gould Fletcher did not drive a car. I think he saw that as part of her masculinity. She tried to teach him, but he couldn't keep it on the road. He wanted her to be the one who hosted his friends, who cooked the meals, who was there to wait on him. And even though they had their separate areas that they did their writing in the home, I think that part of the masculinity that he was seeing in her was her independence and her writing career. I thought that was an interesting comment that he made of her, because she's a very feminine. In all those pictures that you see of her, she's wearing her pearls and the dresses. But I think it was remarking on her independence. And when he would go on his manic rages, they very often would go toe to toe. And she wouldn't just take it from him. So perhaps that was it as well, that she wasn't meek in those incidents.
We do have one comment. Thank you. This is a very interesting topic. Also a writer of history, mainly Black history, with 2 books published. Very impressive presentation. One of my colleagues wants to know, are you going to publish Charlie Mae Simon's biography?
I really would like to. COVID interfered with a lot of plans that I had. Like, we can all say that, right? Mm-hmm. I'm needing to put together a book proposal, and yes, I went into my dissertation with the intention of publishing the biography that resulted from the work. And I have a lot of material that I didn't even touch on in the dissertation, because those special collections are just so full of incredibly rich materials. We're just very fortunate to have 4 special collections that contain her letters, her diaries, the pictures. It's really amazing. And I have the personal library of her books, my own personal library. So there's just a lot of information that, when there is time, right now I'm tied up in teaching. So the summers are when I plan to work toward that. Okay.
As long as you're working on it, I think we're fine.
There you go.
And maybe, if that comes about, it could result in some of her works coming back into print.
I agree. The one that I really would like to see reprinted is Straw in the Sun. That memoir is haunting. It still haunts me. Some of the things that she talks about. And what's really interesting, Guy, about that memoir, because they divorced in 1936, both Howard Simon and Charlie Mae Simon wrote about the homesteading experience. Hers was first published in 1945. His wasn't published until later in the 70s. Neither one of them include the other individual in that experience. She has children that she adopts, but there is no Howard, and he's, a bachelor doing it on his own with men.
That actually gets to the next question in the chat. Could you speak to her decision and Howard's decision not to mention each other in their tender books about their time in Hollis, Arkansas?
I'm wondering if it wasn't an agreement that they made, that we will not mention the other. I have not found any indication of that being an agreement between the 2 of them. There is no indication of either one of them. How shall I put this? He would take trips to New York and leave Charlie Mae there on the homestead. They would both go into Little Rock. She told Fletcher that she wanted to be a wife. That was her goal, to be a faithful wife looking after Howard. And then when they went together to New York City, there was a fallout between them. He had friends, that was his home area. He had a circle of friends he ran around with, parties that he would attend, and she was lonely. And she maintained correspondence that always mentioned her husband. She did the correspondence with Fletcher promoting her husband's art. So this wasn't a case, as from what I have seen, of infidelity on her part. She always promoted Howard. And then the flip of the switch came when she came back to Arkansas and Howard stayed in New York. And then the next letter to Fletcher was talking about, okay, I'm going to stay in Arkansas. This is what I've chosen. And only then did it start talking about there being a love relationship. But it was very, divorce and marriage on the rocks in the 30s, especially when you had careers, that wasn't something that would be public. And it was a quiet marriage for both for both the Fletchers and also Simon. He married 3 days later. So it wasn't just Charlie May and John Will Fletcher. But I found it intriguing that her first and third husbands were both seniors, to that extent, 17 years older, like the father figure. I wonder if she didn't see in Fletcher hope for an ability to use his success as a poet to propel her writing career further. But she was able to do that on her own, her literary merits. So it is intriguing and still a mystery. I thought I would uncover something that was going to just give the answer to everybody, but no, I did on Lowenstein's. I found quite a bit on their marriage that dispelled earlier myths. The idea that there was even someone that said, I think she killed him for the money. But articles that are found about Lowenstein, yes, he left the Memphis area when he didn't marry some French girl that he had promised himself to when he was 17 and 18. So maybe that's why he didn't marry. He saw women who were after his money. But Charlie May just doesn't fit the idea of a gold digger. It seems like they were interested in the same political activities.
Right. Oh, and a gold digger doesn't go to rural Perry County to live in a cabin.
Yeah, definitely.
So it sounds like her relationship with Fletcher, he depicted it as he kind of conquered her, won her over. And it was more, she had a separation from Simon because they were back in New York. She was lonely, she wasn't in her home ground, wanted to return to Arkansas.
Yes.
And so she returned to Arkansas, and here is someone who had been pursuing her, so why not?
Exactly. And let's face it, Howard Simon, his family was Jewish. Mm-hmm. He married a woman who was Jewish. Could be that this was very impulsive. Their marriage in Paris, he proposed 4 days into, he just met her. Perhaps she was not well received by the family. And maybe, I don't know, and I'm not going to speculate on that, but he definitely was back in his roots, and she missed Arkansas, and she knew that she belonged in Arkansas. And I find it to her credit that she never left the state. She remained loyal to the state, an Arkansas writer, writing of Arkansas characters, and also the foreign, the exotic. Her parents were not Jewish. Howard Simon was Jewish, and also Lowenstein, that's another Jewish. But no, her parents were not.
And she, one of her biographies, wasn't it, of a noted Jewish thinker?
Yes. We had Martin Buber was one that she wrote. She also wrote on Hammarskjöld, who was shot down when he was trying to achieve peace in the African countries where there was unrest. He was the secretary. What was he?
UN secretary.
UN secretary, economics. And she wrote about him. She wrote about Schweitzer. Also Andrew Carnegie, another humanitarian she wrote about. One of my favorites of her biographies is A Seed Shall Serve. And what I find compelling is that she and Fletcher both were very disturbed by the way the Japanese were treated in Arkansas, the internment camps. They visited them frequently. They had individuals from the camps in their homes, in their home in Little Rock. He just felt it was such a disgrace what happened to the Japanese who, with their beautiful culture and their poetry. He loved Japanese poetry. And so she going to live in Japan, I feel was also part of Fletcher's dream. And she loved the culture. And her book on Kagawa is a very beautiful book talking about how do we reconcile what's going on in society, and how do we look at the pain of others without doing something about it. So yeah, I definitely think that the idea throughout her writing, all 29 books, comes back again and again to respect for others' culture, and also an awareness of push for social change, and removing prejudice that existed between individuals who might be reading her books.
We do have a comment, someone noting it's not the Arkansas Library Association, but rather the Arkansas State Library that's involved in the Simon Award.
That's misspeaking, yes, on my part. I was going, anytime you go off cuff in a presentation, you're going to miss it. But yes, it is. And yearly that is given. It's interesting. She became reclusive, Guy, in her later years, and she would not attend the ceremonies of the awards. Her sister-in-law would go in her place. She became more and more reclusive the older that she grew, especially in the Little Rock area. She wasn't in good health, and it's kind of reminded me of what's happened to many of us in COVID. She got to where she just didn't want to leave that isolation. So so many of her honors came in the 70s, at a time when she really didn't want a lot of the spotlight put on herself. But it's commendable that up until 2 years before her death, even with her health issues that she did have, she was still writing and publishing books.
Well, and I can't help but to wonder, she wanted to so much write a significant adult work of literature, but it's sort of been pegged as a children's writer. I'm thinking of other writers, Philip K. Dick, who broke ground as a sci-fi writer. He really wanted to write literary work, but he was able to get paid to write sci-fi.
Yeah.
And is there any indication how, did she welcome the idea of there being a Simon Award for children's literature, or?
She was embarrassed by her image being on the award. She didn't want her image to be on it. There was letters back and forth where she requested, please change this. They must have agreed on the image that was there, which we love the Charlie Mae Simon image, but that embarrassed her. And I thought that was an interesting element in some of the letters that I was finding, also going along with that idea of being a little bit more reclusive. But then the same woman would have political meetings in her home after Fletcher's death, trying to bring about change, at the time of the Little Rock Nine. She and her sister-in-law, Aleshia and Terry, she was much more outgoing, her sister-in-law, than she was. And she is the one who would go and speak on Charlie Mae's behalf at any of these events, because she didn't mind being out there in the public. She was someone who used her influence, and they were close. They were very close, even after John's death.
And one last comment. I see similarities between Charlie Mae Simon and Zora Neale Hurston as regards their lifestyles and writings. Can you comment on that at all?
That's interesting, because I'm a huge fan of Zora Neale Hurston as well. Both of them falling into obscurity, both of them with their ethnography, because Zora Neale Hurston, she would go around and gather the music and the stories from individuals. That's what Fletcher and Charlie Mae Simon were trying to do with Vance Randolph in Arkansas. What I find intriguing, the difference that I would say is Hurston, you turned her loose. That woman, when she was in her 20s, that's when she went back and said that her age was younger so that she could get her education, and continually was showing in her literature that she was not reliant upon men for her happiness and financial stability. She was a wage earner, but she also died in poverty. If we didn't have Toni Morrison, we would have lost a lot of what. Actually, was it Toni or was it? No.
Are you thinking Alice Walker?
It is Alice Walker instead. Yeah, it was Alice Walker who uncovered a lot of her work and refound her. But it is interesting, though, to see those connections. What is another interesting element, that her independent nature came out more after John Gould Fletcher's death, because his manic depression did not allow them to travel, and he had to be committed several different times throughout their marriage. And it's amazing to me that she was able to maintain her writing career with the mania that would come from what we would now claim, as a bipolar depression. The number of times he attempted suicide and then finally succeeded, with the Virginia Woolf style, taking off the jacket, folding it, and then drowning himself in a puddle of water. So to be able to, under those circumstances, produce literature, children's literature that is not twaddle, it's kind of an amazing thing that she accomplished in her life.
Well, Dr. O'Neal, I wish to thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you. It's been a fun evening. Appreciate it.
And fantastic, and it'll be archived if anyone wants to view it later on YouTube. And I wish you all the best of luck with your work on getting a biography accomplished, and maybe we can get her work back into print and rescue it from obscurity.
Let's do it, Guy. I say we do it.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you everyone who joined in. We won't have a presentation next Monday, but 2 Mondays from now, we'll have Robin Spear from UA talking about women and foodways in Arkansas history. So tune in for that. Links in the chat. Again, thank you very much. We very much enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone take care.
Mm.